All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Shvach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of Shimon Drushos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Haba Alinu Latova, Aaron and Alana Weinberg, and thanks to Hashem for all of his nisim, both the revealed and the hidden, for the miracle of Yonatan Shai Weinberg 14 years ago, for Besoros Tovos Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, and on the merit of the speedy arrival of Mashiach. Daniel and Batsheva Pava, in creation of the second yahrzeit of Batsheva's father, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Vei, child survivor of Auschwitz, who is zocha to leave over 100 descendants in this world. Of course, as always, we dedicate our learning in the zechus of our precious hostages. May Chadash Baruch Hu, Hashem, bring them home b'shalom and b'karov. In the merit of our holy soldiers, Chadash Baruch Hu, allow them to be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. We have Baruch Hashem, an aggressive day ahead of us today. So today's daf is daf Lamid. We are picking up on Chav Tesima base 29b, 15 lines down from the top. 15 lines down from the top. Gemara says as follows. So let's, good. 15 lines down from the top. So we left off a little bit in the middle of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, well, a lot in the middle of the Mishnah. Hamurias. So remember, now we're going through the list of things that are prohibited. The list of things that are prohibited from an akum. So for example, Hamurias. Rashi points out over here that Murias ultimately is shemen shaldagim, fish oil. And again, obviously in the Gemara, we're going to discuss why all of this is. But Hamurias, ultimately, again, fish oil is prohibited ba'ana, the gvinas base unaiki sha'ovdei kochavim, as well as cheese from base unaiki, and again we'll discuss all of what that is, which is Avoda Zara. Okay, asurin v'isurin isra der Meir. So ultimately, it is prohibited for consumption, and it is also an isra hana. These are words of Rabbi Meir. The Chum say ein isurin isra hana. The Chum agree that there's an isra achila, that you're not allowed to eat both of the fish oil as well as the cheese. But they hold it's only a prohibition of consumption, not a prohibition of hana. Rabbi Yehuda, Shal Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yoshua, Kishayu Mechalchin Baderach. So Rabbi Yehuda says the following: Rabbi Shmuel once asked Rabbi Yoshua when they were walking together on the road. What did they ask? Ma asru gavinos ovdei kochavim. Why is it that cheese of an akum is prohibited? Why is right? And again, dafka idolatrous cheese. Why is it prohibited? Aralo b'pnei shem ma'amitin osa. Very interesting, because often what they would do is they would curdle the cheese in the stomach of an avela. So remember again, I will say there are different ways that one could create cheese. One could curdle cheese. One of the ways is using an enzyme that is found in the stomach called renin. So what would often happen is they would curdle the cheese actually inside of the stomach. Now, whether it means actually inside of the stomach or using the renin of the stomach of an avela, again, we'll discuss, but this is how they would curdle the cheese. Amrullah, he said, 1 second. Well, and therefore the assumption is that halacha l'maisa, that would make the cheese not kosher. So the Gemara says, okay. So the Gemara says, Amrullah, v'halo kevas ola chamura min kevas nevela. But you think about this. The stomach of an ola, or the stomach of a carbon, is more chamur than the stomach of an avela. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is almost right across on the left-hand side. V'alo kevas na ola chamura, sha'ola asura bahana umolin bo. Right? So remember again, I both say, an avela is not asur bahana. An avela is not asur bahana. An ola is asur bahana. Furthermore, an ola is also subject to me'ila. So in that respect, the stomach of an ola is more chamur, is more stringent than the stomach of an avela. Yet, listen to this. Amru yet Chazal said, Kohen shedaito yafa. Now what does this mean, Kohen shedaito yafa? Rashi points out, a Kohen who is not squeamish, what could he do? Sarfa chaya. Ultimately, could take the juices of the stomach, the renin, whatever else is in there, and just swallow it raw. Which is, in other words, that when you slaughter an ola, if the Kohen just wants to drink the contents of the stomach of the nevela, assuming he's not too squeamish, he is allowed to do that. Now, what does that show? That shows us that whatever is found inside of the stomach of an animal is almost considered to be like a non-entity, what we call pirsha ba'alma. It's a non-entity. Halachically, because we'll say, how do we know this? Because if the contents of the stomach of the ola were treated like ola, then what? Remember again, what do you do with the carbon ola? What do you do with it? You totally burn it. So that's the case again, you're not allowed to get any benefit from it. So if the contents of the stomach of the ola were considered to be like ola material, then a kohen would not be permitted to drink whatever is, or gulp down whatever's in there. The fact that he's allowed to indicates to us that once something comes into the stomach of an animal, it no longer has the identity of something meaningful. So it's called pirsha ba'alma. It's like a nothing. It's like a nothing. Therefore, you could gulp it down. If that's the case, then what? Then why should it be problematic just because the cheeses of an akum are curdled in the stomach of an avela? In other words, whatever's in the stomach of an avela is a nothing. Is a halachic non-entity. So why should that cause a problem? The Gemara says, ultimately, again, they did not agree with this statement. However, the Gemara says, aval amru, ein nanin velo molin. So ultimately, again, the other rabbis disagreed with this idea that the kohen could simply gulp it down, right? They say you can't gulp it down, you can't do that. However, what they did agree with is, you shouldn't get hana, but if you did get hana, it's not me'ilah. Which is another way of saying, we don't want you gulping down the contents of the stomach of an ola. We just don't want you doing it. But if you did it, you didn't really do anything wrong. It's not milah. It's not milah. Point over here, what comes out, for the bottom line is that the contents of the stomach of an animal do not have the status of the animal. They have the status of what's called in halacha, the phrase to remember is pirsha ba'alma. A nothing, a non-entity. Amrulo. Oh, okay, you're right. The reason why the cheese of an akum is prohibited is why? Because ultimately they curdle it in the stomach of an idolatrous animal, an animal used for idolatry. Now, obviously, halacha l'maisa, when it comes to Avoda Zara, everything associated with Avoda Zara is going to be usher, right? Even that which is in the stomach of an animal, because Avoda Zara is just categorized in a different category. Look at Rashi. Bekevas egli avodas kochavim shenasu lo takrov esagabi avodas kochav mafilu perish aser denechale benafse sheira yafa. So ultimately, again, Avoda Zara, obviously the math changes. When it comes to Avoda Zara, everything is aser, everything is prohibited, and therefore halacha l'maisa, that's the problem. So therefore it comes out. The issue with the cheese of an akum is that they're curdling it in the stomach of an Avoda Zara animal. If that's the case, then everyone should agree that it's asar ba'ana as well. But yet there's machlokes, right? One opinion says ultimately, again, the cheese is asar ba'ana. The chacham say it's not asar ba'ana. But one second, if it's actually being made in the stomach of, or utilizing the stomach of an animal of Avoda Zara, everyone should agree that halacha l'maisa is asar ba'ana. What's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Hisila davar acher. So this is very interesting. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yeshua kind of diverted Rabbi Shmuel's attention to say, he changed the subject. Now, why Rabbi Yeshua feels the need to change the subject in this, we'll see. But he changed the subject. Amrlo, Yishmael, heich ata kore. Yishmael, how do you read the following pasuk? Ki tovim dodecha miyayin, shir ashirim. Oh, Ki tovim dodayich. So I will say, again, we'll explain this pasuk in the Gemara, but there are two different ways you could vocalize this word. Dodecha, which is Lashon Zachar, masculine, in which case it's referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or Dodayich, which is feminine, in which case it's referring to Klal Yisrael. Amar Ki tovim dodayich. Rabbi Shmuel said, vocalize it as Dodayich, the feminine. Amar lo ina davar kain. To which Rabbi Yeshua responded, that is not correct. Because look at the next pasuk that says, L'reach shmanecha tovim, where the pasuk says literally again, to the scent of your oils is beautiful. Now again, I will say what exactly that exchange means and why there was a diversion of attention. Stay tuned for the Gemara. Good, so I'll say let's go. Fascinating sugis here in front of us. Yain minalan. How do I know that the wine of an akum is asr? So I'll say, so again, this is again, halacha l'maisa, you are not allowed to drink wine belonging to an oved kochavim, right? Assuming even everything is ingredient-wise kosher, you're not allowed to drink it. The Mishnah says you can't drink it, you can't get hana from it. Why not, says the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Amar Baravu, Amar Asher chelev zivachemo yochelu, Yishtu yayin nesicham. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Dvarim. And when it speaks about idolaters, it says that you will drink, literally again, or the fat of their offerings shall be consumed. You will drink the wine of their libations. What do you see from here? The pasuk equates a carbon, an idolatrous carbon, to idolatrous wine. Ma zevach aser ba'ano, af yayinami aser ba'ano. Just like the carbon of Avoda Zara is aser ba'ano, so to the wine of Avoda Zara is aser ba'ano. Okay, zevach gufei minol. And how do you know that the carbon of Avoda Zara is aser ba'ano? Tichsiv vayitzmedu lebal pa'ar vayochlu zivchei mesim. Because the pasuk says, literally again, they attached themselves to Baal Par, which is an Avoda Zara, and they ate the carcasses of the dead. Now, obviously, the carcasses of the dead in this context is a reference to their offerings. Ma meis, aser ba'ano. So you see that the Navi calls, David Melech Tillim calls the offerings of idolatry like a corpse. What do you see from here? Ma meis aser ba'ano, af zevathami aser ba'ano. Just like a corpse is aser ba'ano, so too a idolatrous sacrifice is aser ba'ano. Umeis gufei minalon. Where do you know that a corpse is aser ba'ano? Asya sham me'egla rufa. Gzir shav of egla rufa. What's egla rufa? Find a murdered person between two cities, measure the closest city. Elders of that city come out, decapitate a calf in a dry riverbed, wash their hands over it. We did not shed this blood. Ksiv hacha, the Tamas Sham Miriam. Torah uses lashon of Tamas Sham Miriam died there. Ksiv hasam va'arfu Sham es ha'egla benachal. And it says they will decapitate the calf there in the dry riverbed. Ma lahalon aser ba'ano, just like a mace is aser ba'ano. Afkan nami aser ba'ano. So to egla rufa is also aser ba'ano. V'hasam minalon. How do you know that egla rufa is aser ba'ano? Amri debei Rabbi Yanai kapara ksibei kakachim. Because ultimately the Torah employs lashon of kapara, ultimately again like kachim. So therefore I will say this is nugget number one, piece of information number one. The wine of an Oved Kochavim is aser b'shtiya and ba'ano. You can't drink it, you can't get benefit from it. Why not? Ultimately, again, because the Torah compares it to the offerings of Avoda Zara. And just like the offerings of Avoda Zara, aser ba'achila, aser ba'ano, you can't eat it, you can't get benefit. So to the wine of Avoda Zara, can't drink it, can't get benefit. Incredible. So we'll say, so the next item in the category over here was vinegar of an akum that was originally wine. So we'll say, so another way of saying that was, the akum had wine, the wine turned to vinegar. The halacha is you're not allowed to go ahead and drink it or get hana. To which the Gemara says, pshita, that's kind of obvious. The Gemara says, mishum da'achmetz pakile esura, I don't understand. Remember again, I will say, when did this substance become prohibited? When did it become prohibited? When it was wine. So now that it turned to vinegar, what? You think that the prohibition goes away just because it turns into vinegar? Of course not. Of course not. Amravashi, ha'aslash mo'inon, chometz shalanu biyar ovei kochavim, ein sarech chosem b'so chosem. No, what it's telling us about is an interesting halacha. We'll see. We're going to see a lot of these halachas in the coming weeks. But again, if I deposit my vinegar with an akum, I do not need a double seal. Again, I will say we'll get into this double seals, single seals. I only need one seal. I don't need a double seal. Now, why not, I will say? Because the idea over here is, look at Rashi for just a moment. Ravashi, it's almost right across. Ravashi, so if I, a Jew, deposit my vinegar with an akum, I only need one seal. Why? Because I will say, since an Oved Kochavim doesn't go ahead and use vinegar for libational purposes, and again, it's not going to be worth it for him to tamper with my vinegar. So therefore, if I deposit my vinegar with an akum, ultimately all it requires is one seal. Okay, that's the Mishnah going to teach me. So the Gemara says, because again, if I'm worried about libations, right, sacrificial purposes, Ultimately, an akum does not use vinegar for libational purposes. And if I'm concerned that he's going to switch my vinegar for his vinegar, then ultimately, again, since there's already a seal on it, he's not going to bother with it. It's not worth it. So therefore, again, vinegar would only need one seal. Amar Rav Ilai, Shaninu. Rabbi Shaninu, Yisrael says that's a really interesting sugyas. Yain mavushal sha'ov degachavim, shamitchilas yain aser. If an akum has yain mavushal, we'll say what's yain mavushal? Exactly as it sounds. Cooked wine, mavushal wine. I will say a lot of interesting halachas. We're going to get into this now, contemporary halachas as well. If an akum has yain mavushal, that was originally uncooked wine. So originally it wasn't mavushal. Now it's mavushal. Aser, ultimately, again, it still remains aser. So Gemara says that's obvious. That's like the vinegar case. Pshita, b'yishum de'ivshil pakele isura. Just because he cooked it, now the original isura. When another Rabbi said, what the Gemara is saying is like this: if you have wine that started out in the possession of an akum, that's aser. The fact that it changes, either it changes into vinegar or you cook it, what does that matter? The prohibition still remains in place. Rashi Ha'asal Ashmina comes to teach us, Yain mavushal shalano biyad ovdei kochavim ein tzarech chosem b'sel chosem. What it means, Rabbi say, is that if I deposit mavushal wine in the hands of an akum, right? I take my wine, my kosher mavushal wine, and I deposit with an akum, it does not need a double seal. One seal is enough, right? Why? So Rabbi say is very important. Akum do not use mavushal wine for libational purposes. They only use non-mavushal wine, right? So therefore, again, he's not going to use it for libational purposes. V'imishum top of lamed, v'imishum ichlufei 30a. And if I'm concerned that he's going to swap it out for his own wine, it's not going to happen. Why? Since there is a seal already, he's not going to take the time to try to go ahead and tamper with it and try to then reestablish it afterwards. So Rabbi said this is very important. Just hold on to this piece of information. The Gemara just introduced us to this idea that an akum does not use mavushal wine for libational purposes. By the way, fascinatingly enough, neither do we. The halach is the Rambam paskins that in the Beis Hamikdash you cannot use mavushal wine for korbanik purposes, right? As that's why. And by the way, just as an aside, the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Kiddush. The Rambam says that for Kiddush you have to use wine that is ra'i la'alos al gabe hamizbeach. You should use wine that is fit for libational purposes. That's why people are makbid to only use non-mavushal wine for Kiddush. Again, you're fine if you don't. It's not. Everybody's looking for a good chumrah these days. That might be a good one to kind of sink your teeth into, right? But interestingly enough, where does that come from? And by the way, like in our family, we have the minhag. We only use non-mavushal wine for daled kosos. So there is another halacha like that, because again, the Rambam also paskins, I don't know how this became part of our family, but the Rambam also paskins that halacha l'maisa only non-mavushal wine for daled kosos, because again, daled kosos has to be yain roi lalos agabe hamizbeach. So just interesting aside. But the point over here, the nugget of information over here to keep in mind is that halacha l'maisa, an akum's not going to use mavushal wine for libational purposes. Good. Lamed Amud Aleph, second line. Tan Rabbanon, 38, second line down. Tan Rabbanon, yain mavushal va'alon sishal dekochavim asurin. The mavushal wine and alonsis. Now we don't know what alonsis is yet. We'll have to see. Avin ovei kochavim ultimately again are aser. Alonsis kibriyasa muteras, but alonsis in its original form ultimately again is fine. Rashi says, or before we even know what alonsis is, Rashi says alonsis kibriyasa means shaloch haya yayin mitchila biyad ovei kochavim elalakcha asuya miyad Yisrael. So we're going to see again. I will say. The alonsis. Well, let's see what is in the Gemara. Ve'izui alonsis. What's alonsis? Kidisnan gabe Shabbos. Osin anumalin vein onsin alonsis. On Shabbos, you're allowed to make anumalin, but you can't make alonsis. So we'll say, suggest already before we even get into exactly what these are. So anumalin was a drink that was commonly consumed all the time. Alonsis, we're going to see, was a concoction that dafka you drank when you came out of the bathhouse. Because since coming out of the bathhouse, you could be a little bit overheated. So alonsis was a drink that you would consume kind of in order to cool down your body temperature. Veizu anumalin, veizu alonsis. What are these two drinks? Anumalin, yayin, udvash, upalpalin. Anumalin was wine, honey, and peppers. Sounds good. Alonsis is yayin yashan umayim slulin va'afar simon da'avdi lebe masusa. But ultimately, alonsis is aged wine, clear water, which was water Rashi points out that was allowed to settle, afar simon balsam, and you drank that when you came out of the bathhouse in order to cool down. So what does the Gemara mean? If an akum bought alonsis from Yisrael, that's mutter. In other words, I can get benefit from that alonsis also. Why? Because it was made by Yisrael. The wine was already there. If the akum went ahead and made his own alonsis, that means he utilized his wine. If he utilized his wine, then what? Then the concoction is going to be aser. Okay, so we'll say, so now what the Gemara is going to do is kind of juxtapose and layer two topics, one on top of the other. One is yayin esach, right? So one is general wine of an akum, which is considered to be libational wine. The other one is what's called gilui. Gilui, remember, I've seen this before, is the halacha that if you leave certain liquids exposed overnight, you're not allowed to drink it. Why? There's a concern of snake venom, right? That a snake came along and injected its venom into it. Okay, so now let's watch this. So yayin mazog, diluted wine. Ein ba mishum gilui, is not subject to the halachas of gilui. Rashi points out, what does this mean? Ein ba mishum gilui, shein nachash shosei manu. Snakes do not drink from diluted wine. They only drink undiluted wine. Okay. Yain mavushal, however, again, yain mavushal bosai, which again is what we talked about before. Ein ba mishum nisuch, is not subject to nisuch. Now, what that means is, again, an akum does not use mavushal wine for libational purposes. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, mavushal wine is not subject to yayin esach. So understand what that means. I can purchase mavushal wine from an akum. Now, again, the danger in that statement is that what? That only works if somehow it came into his possession as mavushal. If originally he owned it when it was not mavushal, and then even if he subsequently cooked it, it's still prohibited. That's the Gemara on Amud Beis. Because once he owned it in a non-mavushal state, it takes on the status of yayin nesach, and just because you cook it afterwards does not render it mutter. But technically speaking, yayin mavushal has no status of yayin nesach because an akum does not go ahead and utilize it for libational purposes. Ibaylu. So the Gemara asks kasha. Mavushal yesh mishum gilui or ema mishum gilui. What about, is mavushal wine subject to gilui? In other words, which is what we've established, Shabbosai, is snakes do not drink from diluted wine. Do snakes drink from cooked wine? Do they drink from yain mavushal? So is there an issue if I leave my mavushal wine uncovered overnight? Is there a din ultimately again of gilui for that wine? So Tashma, let's analyze. Hey, Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, al yain mavushal, shein ba mishum gilui. Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi testified, and he said that when it comes to yain mavushal, there's no issue of gilui. No issue of gilui. So therefore, again, if you leave it open overnight, halacha l'maisa, there's no problem. Rabbi Yanai bar Yishmael chalash. So we're supposed to listen to this story. Rabbi Yanai bar Yishmael became ill. So these other rabbanim, Rabbi Shmuel ben Zirud, and the rabbanon went to pay a bikur cholim visit. Yosvi v'kami ba'ilhu. So ultimately, they were sitting with Rabbi Yanai, and they asked him the following kasha: Yain mavushal, yesh bo mishum gilui, oin bo mishum gilui. Does yain mavushal? So we'll say, remember again, when it comes to mavushal wine, what have we established? That it's not used for libational purposes. That we've established. The shaila is it subject to gilui? Meaning, is it subject to the prohibition of leaving exposed liquids overnight? Amar Rabbi Shmuel ben Zirud, Hachi Amar Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Mishum Gavra Rabba. Reish Lakish said the name of a great man. Who's the great man? Uman Rabbi Chia, Yayin Mavushal Ein Bo Mishum Gilui. No. Yain mavushal, no issue of gilui. So if you leave it open overnight, there's no concern that maybe a snake drank from it. Amrulei nismoch. They said to him, could we rely on this ruling? Machvi lahu himoshe machvi Rabbi Yanai bar Yishmael alai val savarai. Rabbi Yanai says, yes, you absolutely can, on me and on my neck. In other words, like literally, I'd be willing to stake my life on it. You absolutely could rely on this ruling. Incredible. We'll say another story. Shmuel va'avleit havu yasvi. So Shmuel and Avleit were sitting together. We'll say Avleit was an akum. So Shmuel's sitting with this guy Avleit who was an akum. And what happens? Aisilu kamaisu chamra mevashla. They brought before them, both of them, a cup or a jug or a bottle of mavushal wine. Mashchi liyadeh. This was incredible. Avleit was very careful not to touch the wine. Not to touch the wine, right? Because again, I will say this is fascinating, by the way. Avleit, although he was an akum, was incredibly deferential ultimately to Shmuel, which I will say is a yisod that we speak about many times. The world respects Jews who respect their Yiddishkeit. At the end of the day, if you take a non-apologetic approach to your Judaism and don't try to do anything but be a proud, upfront Jew, ultimately, the world respects that a lot more than when Jews try to explain things away. So Avleit sees it's wine. He goes ahead and pulls back his hand. He doesn't want to go ahead and touch it. So listen to this. Amar Shmuel, don't worry about it. Hari Amru, yain mavushal, ein bo mishum yain nesach. Don't worry about it, because again, the yain mavushal does not apply to yain nesach. Or I should say, yain nesach doesn't apply to yain mavushal, which I both say, by the way, this is a very important Gemara. Why is it a very important Gemara? Because what would have happened over here? What do you see? How do you render something yayin nesach? How does that happen? Touching it. See, Abba said this is incredibly important. Although our classic understanding of yayin nesach ultimately is wine that was used for libational purposes, what you clearly see from this sugya is the way that wine becomes yayin nesach is if it is touched by an idolater. If it is touched by an idolater. Now, what's the definition of an idolater? We will have to see. But you see, the mere touching of the bottle, right? Avlit wasn't going to start worshiping Avoda Zara over here, but he was careful not even to touch the wine. So Rabbi said, and by the way, this is incredibly important. Now, we're going to discuss that there are going to be multiple gzeros, but Rabbi said, this is very contemporarily relevant. You know, a person has a bottle of non-mavushal wine in their house, and let's say a person has someone not Jewish, a person has cleaning help or something else. One has to be very careful. If a non-Jewish person touches that, if a non-Jew touches that bottle of non-mavushal wine, you cannot use it. You cannot use it. And again, that is now again. There are many layers until we get to that point, but I just want to point out this is a pivotal Gemara because it's not only the active use of that wine for libational, idolatrous service that renders it unfit, but it's the mere touching of that wine that renders it unfit. Just hold on to that. Again, we'll see the halacha l'maisa with this because it's a good halacha l'maisa. I'm saying Rabbi Chia. So let's listen to this. The Beit Servant Rabbi Chia, egluye la'ahu chamra mevashla. So she had some mavushal wine, and it became uncovered. So Askila Kamei Rabbi Chia, Amrle Hare Amru, Yan Mavushal Ein Ba Mishum Giloi. So again, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, some of Rabbi Chia's wine became uncovered, right? The maidservant accidentally uncovered. She left it uncovered overnight. So that's what I mentioned. We're kind of jumping back between two topics over here. One is yayin nesech, and one is gilui. So again, we're just jumping back and forth. So she left some yayin mavushal uncovered overnight. And ultimately, it brought it before Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia said, not a problem, because again, as we said before, snakes don't drink mavushal wine. Therefore, not a problem. Similarly, again, the servant of Rabbi Adabar Ava accidentally left open a barrel of wine overnight, but it was diluted wine. Amrulay Hare Amru Yain Mazuk Ema Mishum Gilo. He said, it's not a problem either, because same way snakes don't drink mavushal, they also don't drink mazuk. They also don't drink dilute. Amra Papa. La Amar Ela de Mazik Tuva. Ava Mazik Velo Mazik Shasi. That's only if it's really diluted. But if it's just a little bit diluted, ultimately again, snakes will still drink it. The Gemara says, Mazik Velo Mazik Mishasi. Is that true? That snakes will drink wine with any level of dilution? Even in other words, that snakes will drink with a small level of dilution? What about the following story? I will say a wild story over here. Vaha Rabba Barav Huna Havaka Azl Ba'arva. One time Rabba Barav Huna was traveling by boat. Vavanakit Chamra Bahadei, and he was carrying a barrel of wine with him. Because why not, right? Why not, right? And you're on a boat, right? Why not? So the Gemara says, "V'chazilahu chivya ditzari v'asi," and in the water he saw a water snake, right, making its way towards him. The snake picked up the scent of the wine, and the snake was headed towards the boat. Amalei l'shamei same ene dadin. Which literally means blind the eye of the snake, which for our purposes ultimately means prevent the snake from drinking the wine. How do you do that? We'll say first white line. Shakal kalimaya shadi bevisar lachore. So the shamus, the attendant, took a little bit of water, put it into the barrel, a very small amount of water into the barrel, and ultimately, again, the snake turned away. What do you see from here? What do you see from here? That a snake doesn't drink of wine even with a very small amount of dilution. That contradicts what we just said before. Okay. So the Gemara says as follows: Achaya masar nafshe Achaya masar nafshe amaziga lo masar nafshe. So this is interesting. So the Gemara says a snake will be moser nefesh for undiluted wine. It will not be moser nefesh ultimately again for diluted wine. In other words, it'll drink both, but it'll put itself in mortal danger ultimately again for non-diluted wine, but will not put itself in mortal danger for diluted wine. I both say tremendous moser haskell. Everything in this world is moser nefesh for something. Everyone is moser nefesh for something. The shaila is, what are you moser nefesh for? Some people are moser nefesh for wine. Some people are moser nefesh for money. Some people are moser nefesh for pleasure. Some people are moser nefesh for the Ribbon Shalom. Some people are moser nefesh for spiritual growth. Everything in this world is moser nefesh, willing to sacrifice for something. The shaila is, what is your area of Mesiras Nefesh? Incredible. So is that true that a snake won't be Moser Nefesh for diluted wine? Rabbi Yanai was in this place. Be'ach Burei is a place. Others say it wasn't Rabbi Yanai, it was Bar Hedja. Ultimately, again, they were going ahead and drinking diluted wine. Pashlu chamra bekuva, v'tzarune beparnuka. So there was some wine left over, and what happens? They went ahead and they covered it. Rashi says parunka is kisu shalbega. They covered it with some type of cloth covering. V'chazi lehuchivya t'shakel mai v'rama bekuba ademali bekuba v'salak chamra iluya. You know parunka v'shasi, and they saw this is incredible. What I'm saying. They saw a snake. Come. The snake filled its mouth with water, slithered up to the top of the barrel, spit in the water, and the snake kept on repeating this until the wine overflowed the top of the barrel. So first of all, the snake deserves it. I'm just saying, give it to the snake. That is Mesiras Nefesh, ultimately, again, for the wine. Point of Rabbi say is what? Is that Allah Chalamai? So you see that a snake will drink even diluted wine. Rabbi say, I will point out again, there is a tremendous Musar Haskell in the Mesiras Nefesh component of this, right? Everyone is being willing to be Musar Nefesh for something. The shaila is, what is the area of life in which you are willing to exhibit your Mesiras Nefesh? Amri, the mazik iyu shasi, the mazik achrini lo shasi. This is incredible. If the snake dilutes the wine itself, sorry, I should say, if the snake itself dilutes the wine, it will drink it. If someone else diluted the wine, ultimately, again, it won't drink it. Incredible. Amr Ravashi, veitem Rav Meshashia, peruka l'sakanto. So he said, ultimately, again, so Ravashi said over here, what are you doing? Right? Don't start giving explanations for sakana. In other words, Chazal said that you're not supposed to drink uncovered liquids. That's it. Don't start trying to explain it's diluted wine, it's undiluted wine. Don't drink it. Don't drink it. Amar Rava says as follows, it's a very important line. Hilchasa, halach l'maisa. So first of all, whether it's diluted or undiluted wine, it is subject to gilui, which means if you leave it uncovered overnight, you should not drink it the next day. And it is subject ultimately again to yayin nesach. Diluted wine is still subject to the halach of yayin nesach, which means if you buy diluted wine from an akum, you can't drink it and you can't get enough from it. By the way, I'll just point out, there's a whole discussion over here, right? We mentioned this before. The Aruch HaShulchan brings down that contemporarily many are not makbid on this idea of gilui, right? That we drink liquids that are left out overnight. We do. The Aruch HaShulchan, now some people are makbid not to. Aruch HaShulchan says, why? This is because the places where we live, we don't really have venomous snakes. In other words, most people don't live in areas of venomous snakes. Therefore, it's not a problem. But I'll tell you something interesting. There is a beautiful, beautiful minhag that, at the Seder, we use the kos shel elio. So many have the minhag that you leave that kos out overnight and you use that kos for kiddush during the day of Pesach. So interestingly enough, there's a whole discussion over here. Do you have to cover that wine overnight? So just interestingly enough, again, I think many of us are passing to Aruch HaShulchan aren't really so makbid on Gilui anymore. So that's why if you leave the kosher Elio out even overnight uncovered, you can still use it for Kiddush the next day. But some dafka cover it in order to be able to use it for Kiddush. Interesting. Okay, so therefore, Roshava says, so number one, halacha l'maisa, diluted wine is still subject to Gilui, and it is still subject to the prohibition of Yayin Nesach. However, Yayin Mavushal, cooked wine, Ein bo mishum gilui. Number one is not subject to the prohibition of gilui. Apparently, snakes do not drink cooked wine. Ve'ein bo mishum yayin nesach. And yayin mavushal ultimately again is not subject to yayin nesach. And I both say these are both halacha l'maisa pieces. So therefore, again, for our purposes, diluted wine subject to both gilui and yayin nesach. Yayin mavushal not subject to yayin nesach, and ultimately again not subject to gilui. Incredible. I'm sorry?
Therefore, Yayin Mavushal is also.
No, Mavushal's fine. Mavushal's fine, right? Mavushal's not subject to Gilui and not subject to Yayin Nesach. Mazug is subject to Gilui and Nesach and Nesach. Shamid Reb Chilkiah Bartuvi Igloyahu Kista Demaya. So let's listen to this. So this assignment of Reb Chilkiah Bartuvi. Ultimately, again, if you look at Rashi over here, Rashi says. No, not yet. Kista shemidas yain sheveir. So ultimately, again, he had a barrel. Kista is a measurement. So he had a kista of water that became uncovered. So v'havinayim gaba. He fell asleep by it. So it became uncovered, but he fell asleep by it. So he came over to Chilki Bartuvi. What is the status of it? So we'll say, so it remained uncovered overnight, but ultimately, again, the attendant was sleeping right next to it. So Amalei, Hari Amru Emas Yashin Aleim. It's not a problem because snakes are generally afraid of people, and if a person is there, even if the person is sleeping, the snake won't come next to it. So that's only true during the day. First of the widest lines, no, but not at night. Not at night. So at night where a person is less aware, the snake will come to drink from a barrel even if there's a sleeping person there. Velohi, the Gemara says, not true. Loshna b'yamav v'loshna b'layla. Right? The Gemara says, Emas yashin alehen lo aminon. Then the Gemara says, not really true. Snakes aren't afraid of people. I mean, they're afraid of afraid of woke people. Everyone's afraid of woke people. Everyone is afraid of woke people, right? But Lamaisa, they are afraid of woke people, right? But not afraid, ultimately, again, of sleeping people. So the Gemara says, Rav lo havashasi mebe arama. So this is very interesting. Rav would not drink. It's not even wine, because wine would be yain nesach. He wouldn't even drink water from an Aramean home. Why? Amar lo zehiri begilui. Ultimately, again, because he said they're not careful with covering things overnight or leaving things uncovered overnight. Mebe amalta shasi, he would drink wine, or he would drink water from a widow's home, a Jewish widow's home. Why? Amar sircha de gavra nikita. Because again, remember, we'll say he's operating from a perspective that in the Talmudic times, lav dafka that a woman necessarily was knowledgeable about all of these halachas, but she would her husband would know, and she would follow her husband's lead. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, we assume that the widow continues her husband's practices even after her husband passed away. We assume that the husband was careful not to leave exposed liquids overnight, and therefore we assume that she continues this practice, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, you could drink the water from a widow's home. Shmuel lo shasi mayim be'al malta. Shmuel would not drink water from a widow's home. Amar lesle emsa de gavra v'lo michsi maya. Her husband is no longer alive, and therefore she doesn't necessarily feel compelled to follow his practices. Aval mibei arma shasi. It's interesting, but Shmuel would drink water from an Aramean home. Why? Listen to this. Nehi de igluya lo kapit amina krusa miyakapit. Even though the Arameans, okay, they're not makpid on gilui, but they were makpid on cleanliness. In other words, Rabbi say, there would be a reason to cover your water in general, which is you don't want impurities falling in. So therefore, Shmuel felt that the Arameans, they didn't know about Gilui, they weren't makbid on Gilui, but they were makbid on cleanliness, and therefore they would have kept their water covered anyway. Others say, Rav lo shasi mayim mebe arama, shasi. Others say, Rav would not drink water from the house of a widow, for the reason we said before, because she didn't cover her water. But from an Aramean house, he would, just the opposite. He would not drink from the Aramean house, but he would drink from the Almana's house. Shmuel shasi maya, lomi be'arma, lomi be'armat. Okay, an alternate version. Shmuel wouldn't drink from either. Okay, so two versions of this. Amir Shmuel Levi. Shalosh yenos ein. I will say there are three types of wine. Ve'ein bahem mishum giloi. And these three types of wine ultimately are not subject to gilui, which is another way of saying these three types, a snake will not drink from them. Now, so what are these three types of wine? Ve'elohein, chad means sharp wine, mar, bitter wine, masuk, sweet wine. So let's go through these three categories. Chad, so what's sharp wine? Tila charifa, dimitzri zeki. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over Tile Charifa, Rashi says Min Yain Chazak ve'in Tamotov umasuk el kechometz umitog chasko ein nachash shosehu. So ultimately, and this was a sharper wine, almost like a vinegary type of wine that had a sharper flavor, and therefore a snake doesn't drink it. Okay, mar. What's mar wine? So Rashi says over here. Rashi says that is yarnaka. Okay, so a bitter type of wine. So masok, what's masok? The Gemara says chulya. So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says first of all, mar yarnaka. Rashi says ra umar. This is just a bitter wine. What's the sweet wine? Chulya. Rashi says masok machmas hashemesh besoch hanavim v'shuvein hagun. So we'll say this is fascinating. You know what the Gemara is describing over here? What we call today a late harvest wine, right? What's a late harvest wine? You allow the grapes to remain on the vine longer. There's a greater sugar concentration, and that makes a sweeter wine. Now understand, in times of the Gemara, sweet wine was considered to be inferior. So now again, a late harvest wine, a dessert wine, it's delicious, right? But Lamaisa, for them, that was considered to be an inferior wine. Amongst all of these wines is a snake would not drink these wines. So the Gemara says, good. Rav Chama masni li'iluya. So Rav Chama ultimately said, no, that these wines actually are good. Chad, chamar upalpalin. So sharp wine is wine that is flavored with peppers. Mar, what's bitter wine? Aspenisin was ultimately again wine made from a particular herb or plant. Again, so just want to point out, Rav Cham is just arguing. Rav Cham is saying, before the Gemara says these three types are inferior wine, Rav Cham is disagreeing that they're actually superior wine. Masok me barag. Again, I will say these are all different types of plants and herbs. Rashi says mashke meshubach ba'arag lashon paras meshubach. So that's a Persian word. Barag apparently means superior. Amru Shimon Lakish. Karina, ein bo mishum gilui. Karina is not subject to gilui. That's great. My Karina, what is Karina? Amr Yavo, chamra chalya da'ase me Asya. Sweet wine that comes from the city of Asya. But in Asya itself, where this was the common drink, it would be subject to gilui. So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason for that? Chamar Medina, because it's the common drink there in Asya. Therefore, since that's the normal drink, therefore snakes would drink it also. Good. Amar Rav says as follows: Yomi I will say if wine begins to turn to vinegar. So within the first 3 days that the wine begins to turn, interestingly enough, it still has the status of wine. First, it still has the status of wine, and therefore, because it has the status of wine, it is subject to gilui umishum yayin nesach and subject to yayin nesach. Right. So first 3 days that it begins to turn, still wine status. Therefore, subject to gilui, subject to yayin nesach. Amud beis mikan ve'elach. After those 3 days, ein bo mishum gilui, ve'en bo mishum yayin nesach. So this is after pretty much the wine turns. So after the wine has already turned to vinegar, it is not subject to gilui, and it is not subject to yayin nesach. Okay, unardoy say afilu lebasar tzlas yomi chayshinan mishum gilui. The nardoim say no. Even after 3 days, they agree that after 3 days it is not subject to yayin nesach, but they do hold that after 3 days it is still subject to gilui. What's the reason? My taima zimnin mikri v'shasi, because sometimes a snake will still drink that turned wine. Okay, incredible. So Tan Rabbanon, Yayin Toses, I will say, what's Yayin Toses? Rashi says, Yayin Chadash Megito, Achu Machmes. I will say, now remember again, how do you make wine? Right, so you take grapes, you press grapes, you go ahead and you collect the juice in a vat. Then you allow the fermentation process to begin, right? Remember again, wine has to be fermented. So that's called Yayin Toses. Yayin Toses is when the wine itself is fermenting into wine. Toses literally means bubbling, because if you ever see the wine fermentation process, there is like a bubbling that takes place. So yayin toses ein bo mishum gilui. So when the wine itself is in the fermentation process to become wine, it is not subject to gilui. Again, because the assumption is not the assumption. Or also remember again, I just want to point out, this is not like theoretical, metaphysical, esoteric. This is realities that they're living with. So this is reflective of what they're actually seeing. So a snake will not go ahead. Ein bo mishum gilui. A snake doesn't drink yain toses, and therefore again, halacha l'maisa. Halacha l'maisa is subject to gilui. But kama tisisa. So how long is that fermentation process? Gimel yomim, 3 days. 3 days. Okay, hashchalan. By the way, I just want to point out something very interesting. You also see something fascinating about the Zara here. The fact that Chazal said that certain liquids, the prohibition of gilui does apply, certain liquids it doesn't apply, also tells us that there is flexibility within the Zara itself. Now, as we're both saying, not our topic for today, but there are 2 different ways in which Chazal make takanas or gzeros. So one is what's called the low plug. A low plug just means it applies across the board. Other times, Chazal allowed for what we'll call gzero or takana modification based on circumstances. So what you notice over here is Chazal didn't say any liquid that left overnight is going to be prohibited because of the possibility of snake venom. You see again, this liquid yes, this liquid no, this circumstance yes, this circumstance no, which tells you that there by definition is built-in flexibility into the gzera, which by the way, just translating that contemporarily, which is why the Aruch HaShulchan says that if you live in an area where there are no snakes, it's quite possible that one need not observe this particular prohibition. It's just interesting. Okay, let's go weiter. The Gemara says, "Ushchalayim ein bo mishum gilui." Cress, right? Any item with cress, apparently again that's like a snake repellent, is not going to be subject to gilui. Ubnei gola nogu bahen iser. But again in diaspora they were noeg iser with cress. The Gemara says, "V'lo amar ela delespu chala." That's only if there's not vinegar mixed in. Aval ispu chala migri bahu. But ultimately, again, if there is vinegar that's mixed in, ultimately, again, the vinegar really acts as a repellent and pushes away the snakes. Kusach habavli. It's been a while. It has been a while. Right? Kusach habavli. Everyone's favorite Babylonian dish made with moldy bread and curdled milk. So the Gemara says, Ein bo mishum giloi. Now here's what's fascinating also. Up until now, we've always been assuming that the prohibition of gilui is with liquids. Now, granted, kusach is a dip. It is a dip. But remember, again, everyone knows good kusach was made thick, right? So l'maisa, what's fascinating to note over here is that halacha l'maisa, we're beginning to see an application of gilui even to non-liquid items. So kusach habavli is not subject to gilui. Ubnei gola nagu ba'isr. But in the diaspora, ultimately, again, they said that it is subject to gilui. Interesting. Amar Menashi, ispe nekuri chashinan. I will say it's very interesting. As much as we say that halacha l'maisa, so kusach is not subject to gilui, but if you wake up in the morning and you see what looks like 2 fang marks in your kusach, take a pass on that, right? Take a pass on that, right? So interesting, as much as we're not choshesh, if you see some physical evidence that something got into your kusach, do not go ahead and eat it. Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi, Amar Shmuel. May tif ein bo mishum gilui. So this is very interesting. If you look at Rashi says tif kli shetachas chavis shemekabel yain hanotev. If you have, so imagine for a moment you have a barrel of wine, right? Right? You have a barrel of wine, and then the barrel has a drip, so you place another receptacle under the barrel to catch the drip. Now, I will say tif means that literally, again, there's a steady drip from the barrel into this other receptacle. Ultimately, again, the contents of the secondary receptacle are not subject to gilui. Now, I will say, what's the reason for that? The reason for that is interesting. The noise of the drip scares off the snake, right? It's interesting. So that's why Amar Rashi v'hu da'avid tif lahade tif. That's only if there is the sound of a constant drip. So the sound of a constant drip ultimately, again, will chase away the snake. Incredible. So this is very interesting. The opening of a date is not subject to gilui. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. So remember, when you remove a date from the tree, there's like an opening in the date. So again, let's say I left that date on the table overnight. The Gemara says you don't have to be concerned that maybe a snake came and injected venom into we'll call it the date slit. The opening of the date. Kiman, whose opinion does that reflect? Ki haitana. The Gemara says, "The sign Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ochel Adam Arnavim Uteinim Balayla, Ve'no Choshesh." Ultimately, a person could eat grapes and figs by day. I said date, I meant figs. Grapes and figs at night, and he doesn't have to worry about any type of snake venom. I was about to say, I might have thought that because these items, by definition, when they're removed, have an opening, that perhaps halacha l'maisa, again, the snake is going to come along and inject the venom. Ultimately, there's no need to be concerned about that. Why? Mishum shenemar shomer pesayim Hashem. I will say, this happens to be a fascinating idea. Shomer Pesayim Hashem means HaKadosh Baruch Hu watches over his simple ones. I will say, now what does this mean? What this means is that Chazal often use this. There are certain activities of life that, let me say it a little bit differently. The halacha is, one is not allowed to put themselves b'makom sakana, in a place of danger. But yet there are certain activities that by definition have an element of danger. So how am I allowed to do them? So essentially the halacha is like this. As long as it's what we call activities of daily living, we assume Shor Pesayim Hashem. We assume ultimately, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu watches over a simple one. So again, driving carries with it an inherent risk. Crossing the street carries with it an inherent risk. I'm allowed to do it because these are activities of daily living. Again, skydiving might be a different shaila, right? It might be a different shaila, right? But Lamaisa, the Gemara says, you could eat these fruit. Shor Pesayim Hashem. What about the fact that a snake came along and injected its venom? No, you don't have to worry about that. So Gemara is right. Amar Safra Mishra Mishra Deroma Shlosha Mine Arasein. This is very interesting. There are three different types of venom. Shel Bacher Shokea. So ultimately, again, the venom of like a young snake, like a bacher snake, so that sinks to the bottom. Assuming we're talking about it's injected in liquid, so that sinks to the bottom. That's a bacher snake. Shel Benoni, right? I guess like a middle-aged snake. Mifafea. So ultimately, again, the venom hovers. Shel Zakin Saf. But ultimately, again, of an older snake, the venom is much weaker, so to speak, and therefore it floats at the top. So the Gemara says, L'meimra. We'll say, by the way, there's a lot of profundity in this also, not just for snakes, but for people also, right? When we're young, sometimes one of the hardest things when you're young is you're heavy. What does that mean? We think we know everything. And because we think we know everything, ultimately it is so common to get caught in our ways. And we're just like immobile. Sometimes it's laziness, right? Sometimes when we're young, we're just lazy. We just don't feel like doing anything or just doing our own thing. And we just kind of settle to the bottom. As we get older, what ends up happening? We become a bit more mobile. But you know what the great irony of life is? When do I become most aware, ready, and open to change? Often when I'm older, and it's a little bit too late to affect real change in life. That's the great irony of the human condition. By the time I actually know everything I need to know in order to lead an impactful life, often I'm too old to implement a lot of that information. So I will say, so the goal is to become floating when you're a bacher, right? Or at least, again, when you're a Benoni. Don't wait until you get old and you've amassed all life information and knowledge in order to do the things in life that you really need to do. But even in our younger stages, I will say, we should not become immobile. Even in our younger stages, we should not float to the bottom. Even in our younger stages, we should be courageous and able enough to make the kind of changes that we know we need to make. Incredible. So Gemara says, L'meimra, so he's saying now that the older you get, the weaker your strength is. In other words, so obviously an old snake has quote-unquote weak venom. It's floating to the top. Vatanya, but we learn, Shlosha, Kozman Shemaskin, and Gvur Mitosefes. But we learn there are three things in this world where the older they get, the stronger they become. Eluhain, these are them. Dug, Nachash, Chazer. A fish, a snake, and a chazer. Now we'll say, by the way, incredibly enough, who's not in that category or what's not in that category? Man. Fascinating, right? There are some things in this world that the older they get, the stronger they become. It's not us. The older we get, the weaker we become. Which I will say, why is this so important in life that if you want to accomplish things, don't wait. Like we say in Mishnah and Avos, Al Tomer L'Chisha Efna Eshna. Don't say that when you have time you'll learn. Don't say when you have time you'll do this. Don't say when I get older I'll do this. My kids grow up, I'll do this. I make more money, I'll do this. If there's something that needs to get done in life, do it now. Because the older you get, the weaker you get. And the weaker I get, the more limited I am. And the more limited I am, the lower the probability that I'm going to accomplish those things in life that I want to. It's not impossible, it's just a lot harder. It's just a lot harder. And I both say, this is, we don't have time. Okay, let's go back there. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says as follows. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, you're right. Asuvihu de kamosav zihiri kolish. At the end of the day, the snake gets stronger, but its venom is lessened. So interestingly enough, the snake itself on a physical level, interestingly enough, does get older with age, but lamaisa, the power of its venom ultimately is weakened. So the Gemara says, Shal bachar shokel ma'hilchasa. So when you're telling me this now that the venom of a bachar sinks to the bottom, okay, that's interesting fact, good to know. What does it matter? Watch this. If you have a barrel of wine that was left open overnight, even if 9 people drank from it and did not die, the 10th guy still should not do the same thing. Why? It once happened that there was a barrel of wine that was left open overnight. 9 people drank from it, and the 10th one didn't. I'm sorry, 9 people drank from it and didn't die. The 10th guy drank from it and it died. How do you explain that? Because what happened? It was ultimately, again, a young snake that drank from it. What happens with young snake? The venom sinks to the bottom. The venom sinks to the bottom, and ultimately, so the first 9 were absolutely fine, but the last one ultimately suffered the consequences. We'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, what a run, incredible, absolutely. This essentially was like 2 days of Daf Yomi, really 2 days. Baruch Hashem, good, we're back on track. Shkoyach, everyone, a good Erev Shabbos. All right, Chavran Zuma, good Shabbos, everyone, good Shabbos.